Everyone is interested in whether this eruption is really over or if this is just a pause, and the bottom line is we just can't answer that question with certainty yet. It's typical for eruptions to wax and wane and sometimes stop. In the recent history, Kilauea has had eruptions that have paused for 16 days and come back rather vigorously. And in the Mauna Ulu days, there were a pause of 3.5 months before eruption returned. So it's very difficult to call this eruption over. That said, what we look for is basically monitoring data that's showing no sign of magma accumulation or significant movement underground. And right now, that is the case in Lower Leilani. We're seeing very few earthquakes, no deformation, but we are still seeing very high temperature cracks. Some of the cracks in the western Leilani area have been changing in the last week, expanding a little bit. So we're not quite sure what that means, but it could still mean that magma is fairly shallow and still moving around, and the dike is not completely inactive. So we're watching that carefully. Our crews are going in and measuring the cracks and checking temperatures quite frequently. And so we did see seismicity in the earliest part of this eruption as the dike was breaking the surface. And then we saw it again when it moved a little bit down rift, you may recall. Since then, it's been a very seismically quiet part of the rift zone, and that's probably because the vents were open, the dike had reached the surface, and so it wasn't breaking a lot of rock, and that's what causes earthquakes. So in point of fact, if it were to resume activity at any of the fissures right now, we don't expect necessarily a lot of earthquake activity. What we will see is tremor, which is the movement of magma. The other thing we should see is an infrasound signal, and that's from our stations down there that are looking at these signals that travel through the air that point back towards sources of lava emission. Deformation, we may not see any change in those signals either right now, because again, the dike was to the surface, it opened the ground, it doesn't have to do a lot to come back to the surface. What we're really looking for instrumentally is sign of pressurization, and maybe uprift pressurization if pressure begins to build. So while I won't rule out that we're going to see earthquakes and deformation before a resumption, it may not happen. Fissure 8 is, of course, hidden from view unless you really fly right over it. And today our unmanned aerial system flew over the vent late in the afternoon and looked down. There still is an active puddle of lava inside the crater. I'm estimating it's 15 or 20 feet across. It's not very big, but you can see lava moving and bubbling. Gas levels are way down. I think our recent measurements are well below 1,000 tons per day. There is still gas coming out of Fissure 8, and that's typical if there's lava at the surface and some of the adjacent fissures. So as the vents cool down and water gets involved, you start to produce more H2S, and so that's probably why people are smelling it. And remember, the human nose is extremely sensitive, so smelling H2S at extremely low levels. There was a time when the gas emissions from Pu'u went up very briefly, and now they're back down to what they've been for a long time. But Tamara Elias said the other day that really right now, Kilauea is putting out less SO2 than we've seen in a long time, certainly in 10 years. So yesterday on our helicopter assessment, we did see fingers of lava still oozing into the ocean. And so that's just the lava flow draining. It was a very large volume lava flow that was active. So it'll take a little while for all that liquid interior to slowly seep out and solidify.
And any comments on Pohoiki, what we're seeing there, amazing geology?
It is amazing geology in motion, sedimentary geology. The last picture I saw, I think, showed the sandbar had built out across the entire mouth of the harbor. And so that's sand that was developed and is being developed up current to the east by where these lava flows went into the ocean. And that could be a sedimentation pattern we see for a long time.
Could that possibly ever become like a warm pond?
The pond that has been created by the sandbar? Yeah. I don't know. I know that nearby there's a warm pond, and if there are warm springs coming in there, I suppose it could, but I'm not aware that there are springs feeding that little part of the coastline. We're still monitoring the volcano very closely. We've got field crews in there during the day. At night we're on call. We have got someone down at Civil Defense still from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, watching the data very carefully. So we're ready to react quickly if something happens. And I think that's just another point I'd like to emphasize, is that a resumption of activity could happen very quickly. So that's one reason we're staying vigilant. And people who are in the area should always stay posted about what's happening and be ready to move quickly.